Hello, everyone, officially. My name is, I know a lot of you haven't seen me before. My name's Rakov. I grew up in Sioux Falls, not far from here. Now I'm a student at Creighton University. I'm studying biochemistry, pre-med, so yeah, in Omaha now. I'll be teaching you guys ACT English, and I don't know, am I supposed to cover anything else? Oh, yeah, and I was in this class a while ago, like 4 years ago. I got a perfect 36, so now I'm here, hoping to get you guys to the same position. So I'll be here 5 times throughout this entire class, and each of the 5 times will tackle a little bit different part of the ACT English test. So hopefully by the end we can, as a class, feel very prepared. I'll show you all different types of things about the test, different intricacies, different strategies. So we'll cover them throughout our 5 hours together. And is there anything else we need to cover before we get started? Today, just for reference, we won't need any of the practice books or any of the homework books. Just a clean sheet of notebook paper should be perfectly fine for us. So let's just start with what. Ooh, someone just came in. Let's just start what does the ACT English test look like? What does it mean? In general, the ACT defines its English test as something that covers standard usage and mechanics and rhetorical skills. So those are just kind of 2 different categories that we'll cover, and we'll talk about what those mean in a minute. But the most important thing that I like to start with is just the structure of the test. There's going to be 5 different passages. There's going to be 75 different questions, and you're going to have 45 minutes to complete those. So if you do a little bit of math, I know that's not what we're doing here, but that would be about 9 minutes per passage. You can fluctuate that obviously a little bit if you need to, depending on your own test taking strategies and how fast you are. But we'll get to talking about that later too. So so 5 passages, 75 questions. So that leaves you 15 questions per passage. And it's going to test, like I said, your standard usage and mechanics and your rhetorical skills. So those are the main 2 things we're going to be talking about across my 5 times here. This is just an interesting breakdown. I think that'll help you put into perspective what standard usage and mechanics and rhetorical skills means. So up here, I've written down 2 different categories that the ACT likes to define as their standard usage and mechanics and rhetorical skills. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to call them the easy section and the hard section. The reason I have quotation marks around easy and hard is because one of them is not easier than the other one. You could, in general, people tend to get these type of questions that I consider easy right more often, but that doesn't mean those questions are easier. The reason I classify them as this is because they take less time. They're not going to require you to think as hard. You're not going to have to do anything abstract. There's going to be a rule that I'll teach you, and if you follow the rule, you'll get the question right. These ones, I can only do so much. I'm going to teach you guys exactly how to think through them and what to do when you see a question, so you're not going to panic. You're not going to see anything new on test day that I haven't showed you before. However, you guys will have to be able to think by yourselves to get these type of questions right, so that's why I consider them hard questions. They're not exactly hard. If you follow what Manoj and I teach you throughout this time, then they shouldn't be hard. It's just they will tend to be a little bit more independent. You'll have to think a little bit more. There's not going to be like a set rule that'll tell you how to do it. So I'll walk you through each of these categories really quick. So punctuation, these percentages, by the way, sorry I didn't say that. These percentages are exactly the abundance that will show up on the test out of the 75 questions. So you're going to have 13% of the questions that you see are going to be related to punctuation. And that's going to be today's topic. We're going to talk about punctuation, but we'll get to that. So yeah, punctuation just includes commas is the most common one, obviously. You're going to have semicolons, dashes, periods. Everything related to punctuation is just going to be in this section. Grammar and usage is a little bit different because it's going to be more related to making things like sound and like structurally correct and using the right type of words that mean the correct thing. So when you're saying something, you want to make sure that what you have in your head is what's being put on the page and the reader isn't getting confused. So that's what those entail. There's going to be about 16% of those. Sentence structure is a surprisingly high percentage. It's going to be the most abundant. 24%, to be honest, I sometimes struggle to believe that figure. That's what the ACT says, but like more often than not, it feels like there's less of those because the sentence structure questions, half of them are very, 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 very easy, and the other half are you have to know some rules. So we'll talk about those rules as well eventually. That just means ordering sentences correctly, which across a paragraph, maybe which sentences should come first and which should come later. Should you make sentences really, really long or really, really short or somewhere in between? Those type of things are going to fit in sentence structure. And that's your easy or your usage and mechanics section. Then you're going to have a harder or rhetorical section where you're going to talk about organization. So throughout an entire passage, which order should you put your paragraphs in? Organization entails things like transition words sometimes too, about when you start a new paragraph, how are you to start that paragraph? How do you make sure that those two things connect? So things like that. Strategy is the most, that's going to be 15% by the way, organization. Strategy is the most, in my opinion, confusing because it's hard to tell what strategy means when you're talking about English. Like there's a lot of different things strategy could mean. So I'm going to leave that one up in the air because we will cover it a few lectures from now. And then lastly, author style. I think we all know what that means. It's like you have to follow a certain person's writing style when you're taking this test. You're not ever going to be writing for yourself. So one of the key points we'll talk about in a minute here is about how you're an editor. So you want to follow the person's who's writing it style, not your own. So yeah, that's going to come up about 15% of the time. So those are your two main sections. And we'll talk about each section individually throughout our time here. Today we're going to cover punctuation, like I said, so we'll get to that once we get over some more basic things. But one of the main categorical things we should talk about here is like with your easy questions, the note here that I'm bringing you this for is like in general you're going to take less time on these easy questions than you are your hard ones. So the top category, those quote unquote easy ones, should take you like 5 to 10 seconds, let's say. You'll see the question. If you know the rule, you'll look at the answer choices and pick the one that follows the rule, and that's it. So 5 to 10 seconds most of the time. The harder ones will be a little bit, they're already challenging. They're going to make you think. You might have to refer back to the text a little bit and scroll pages a little bit, see where things fit, try some different things. So those, I would normally assume 15 seconds to a minute, sometimes even a little bit more is okay. So those ones are going to take you more time. So just, I'm putting that out there. Not all of these are going to be uniform the same amount of time. So when we do start practicing, don't get stressed out if a question's taking you a little bit longer. It's supposed to. The ACT designs them that way, where some are going to be very time consuming and some won't be. Don't worry about that. And then just a small point here. The entire test is going to have about 40 of these easy questions and about 35 of these harder ones. So that'll give you your total 75 questions. So that's just what the structure of the test is going to look like. I'm going to give you, before we start today, for some of you, I know a lot of you have taken this test before, I've seen the ACT before, and a lot of you haven't. So just for quick reference, can I get, how many of you have taken the test before in person? No one's taken it? Have you guys seen it before? Not at all. Okay. Online, I think there's a little emoji thing you can use where like it raises your hand for you. Oh, okay, someone got a thumbs up figured out. Can you tell me, give me a thumbs up or a hand raise or whatever if you've taken or seen the ACT before? Okay, not many. Oh, okay, no, more coming in. Okay, so a lot of you guys are maybe unfamiliar or haven't seen it before, so we'll work on that all together. Good, that's good information for me. So I'm going to start with general information that I want you to remember before we ever look at anything. Keep this in mind when we're in this class all together. The first and to me most important rule is remember that you are an editor when you're in this class with me. When you're on the test on the ACT English section, you're an editor. You're not an author. You're not just a reader. You're an editor. So you're not going to change what the person's saying. You're not going to pick things based on what sounds best all the time. You're going to pick what is correct and what fits what the person is trying to say, not what you're trying to say. So just remember, overarching, you're an editor. You're not an author. You're not a reader. You're an editor. Okay, now another big important thing is a lot of people don't know what ACT English means. Like, what does English mean? We all speak English. And that's a really important thing, I think, to just reiterate and, like, emphasize to you guys. You all speak English perfectly fine. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. So there's going to be a lot of times where questions are going to get confusing, and maybe you don't remember the rule, or maybe maybe the rule's a little bit confusing to you, and that's okay. Just remember, you all speak English. Trust yourself. A lot of the times your ear is going to tell you what's right. Or, oh, that sounds the best, so maybe that's going to be right. I'm going to give you some rules later on that go against what you think, or what you normally feel, or what you normally say. And that's okay. So it's important to, most of the time, trust yourself, but also know when not to trust yourself, because there's going to be certain exceptions. I'll highlight those to you guys so you know. But just be aware there's going to be some things that are against what you think, but more often than not, you all speak English. Just trust what you know. Okay, third thing, I cannot reiterate how important it is to just remain positive and don't let yourself get down during this test. It's the first one of 4 sections on the ACT. You're going to take this one first. So it can be easy to let yourself get down if things aren't going so well in your first passage. Maybe you feel not so good about a few questions. Please, please, please try your absolute best to not let yourself get discouraged by that. The greatest thing about the ACT English section is there's so many questions. So you have a lot of chances to try again and to prove that you know what you're doing. Missing one question or missing a few questions isn't going to change your score by a ton. A lot of the times it won't even change your score. The first time I ever took the ACT, don't tell anyone this, but I did miss an English question, but I still got a 36 on the section because 74 out of 75 is still really, really, really good. So don't worry about missing questions here or there, because this test is designed so that it's very long. It's testing a macro scale of knowledge, not just if you can do this exact thing. So don't let yourself get down. Keep chugging along. Keep pushing forward. And forget about the next question, or forget about the last question, and focus on the next one when you're going through this. You're supposed to be trying to find a flow when you're doing this test. Yeah, okay. And last thing that is going to come up, we're going to talk about it a lot on this grammar and usage day, but the golden rule of the ACT English section, every single teacher that's ever talked about ACT English is going to mention this rule, and it's simply that less is more. You're going to see this come up when we talk about punctuation too. The rule is simply less is more. We call it the economy rule in English, like the community calls it the economy rule. But basically what that means is sometimes you might have answer choices that look really similar and sound really similar, or maybe they mean the same thing, but one of them is a little bit longer and one's a little bit shorter. Just pick the shorter one. I promise you, we all have extremely limited schedules. We all aren't here forever. There's only a certain amount of time, and when you can say something in less words, just say it in less words. If it means the same thing, you don't need more words. That's going to hold true across all of your sections and all of this stuff. That's a huge, huge, huge important thing. And I'll refer back to that plenty when we get through all of this stuff. So just remember, less is more on this test. So if you have to delete things, if you have to change things to make them shorter, do that. That's super duper important. Just remember, more often than not, less is going to be more for you. So, okay, those are just some beginning things into the ACT English. Let's get into today's topic. We're going to be talking about all the different rules you could see under this category, under this 13%. Every single punctuation rule that you're ever going to see on the ACT. There's some things you don't have to worry about on the test. For example, like spelling. I might be the worst speller you've ever met in your life, but that didn't stop me because spelling luckily isn't tested. So there's going to be certain things like that that it's great because you don't have to worry about it. But punctuation, unfortunately, is one thing that's tested very heavily and very directly. They're going to talk about punctuation quite a bit. So we're going to cover it all the way through. And there's only a certain amount of punctuation rules. You don't have to remember everything. There's only going to be certain parts that they're going to test. Let's start with the most common one, the strongest one, the one we tend to use the most when we're writing, and that is commas. There are a ton of comma rules. We're not going to cover all of them in English because there's too many. But there's only a certain amount of few that the ACT is going to test you on, and those are the ones we're going to talk about. A lot of these you guys already know pretty well because all English speakers, and like some of them they've been teaching you since you were little kids. Some of them are a little bit more confusing and maybe we haven't heard of. So we're going to talk more in depth about those. Some of them we might go pretty quickly because I'm sure you've seen them before. But before we even start, always feel free to just interrupt me and you don't have to raise your hand, just ask if you have a question, because I don't always see hands risen, so just feel free always. And online people, same thing. Just unmute yourself and ask if you ever have a question, or if you can't see the board or anything like that, just let me know. This is all for you guys, and I want to make sure everyone is getting the same stuff out of this, so just always feel free to stop and ask questions. Okay, let's start with the first rule. And the first rule says that commas set off items in a list. The rule is that commas set off items in a list. This is one of those that you probably learned since you were little kids. I'll throw in examples on all of these. So one of them, let's say for this one, would be I love cooking, my friends, and my family. Okay, now, this is a very famous example because a certain magazine, I won't mention, has messed this exact sentence up very, very badly that we're going to talk about in a second. But the sentence here says, I love cooking, my friends, and my family. And because I'm listing 3 things that I love, I have to put commas in between. So there's one right there, one right there. So anytime you have a list, you use commas to set it off. Now, this is going to be a hard question. So if anyone knows the answer, shout it out. If you're wrong, don't worry, this is really hard. Does anyone know what that exact comma right there? What is that comma called? There's a special name for that comma. Do you know it?
Closing comma?
Closing comma is a good guess. A lot of people do refer to it, but I'm looking for something else. Oxford comma. Oh. Awesome. Really good, yeah. So the comma right before the last thing in a list is called the Oxford comma. The reason it's called that is because it's under a huge amount of debate all the time amongst a bunch of scholars about, is that comma valid? Should it be there? Should it not? So maybe some of you write like this, without the comma there. And that's perfectly fine, but for the ACT, they're always going to use the Oxford comma. So don't ever put that in question. Use commas between every single item in your list. The reason I chose this example, however, is that if you were to remove the Oxford comma, now it says, I love cooking, my family, and my friends. And it's comes off a little bit weird. And if you weren't to use no commas at all, I love cooking, my family, and my friends. That's why commas are important in lists. So, in my opinion, you should always use the Oxford comma anyway, but for the sake of the test, please use the Oxford comma. They're not going to ask you to not. Yeah.
Is the Oxford comma only in lists, or is it also there for unnecessary information?
Only in lists is when they refer to it as the Oxford comma. In other times when there's unnecessary stuff at the end of a sentence, there's a different rule. So the comma isn't called the Oxford comma, but yeah. Does that make sense to everybody? The list one? Online, does everyone get that? Okay, I'm going to assume that means yeah. Okay, some people are sending thumbs up. Good. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay. Now, commas can also separate cities from states, and days from years. This one I like to think we all pretty much know, but it's actually surprising that it's kind of tricky when you look at it sometimes. So for example, if we're talking about where we are right now at this moment, we would say we're talking about Sioux City, and we mention the state. For example, we say Sioux City, Iowa. Excuse me. Then we would have to put a comma between there to separate those two things, just to make it clear that they're two separate things. They're not one big mush of things. So Sioux City, Iowa. Let's talk about maybe the most important date in history. If you're talking about a certain day from a month into a year. So if we're talking about September 25th, 2004, to separate these two pairs of numbers, it's kind of confusing when you see 25 and 2004 right next to each other. You're going to put a comma right there. So you're always going to be able to separate days from years with commas as well. And if anyone's wondering, it's important because that's when I was born. Do these make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Online, does everyone kind of get those? Okay, awesome. So those two are pretty straightforward, right? I like to start with the easiest ones because maybe we can get some momentum going into ones that might be a little more challenging for us, but I think we're doing great so far. Okay, now, commas are gonna I use this phrase set off a lot, so you'll see it again here. Commas can set off. This is a tough word to spell, and you know I'm a bad speller, so I'm gonna have to have my notes. Bear with me. Okay. Commas are going to set off subordinating or dependent clauses. Now, subordinating and dependent don't technically mean the same thing, but for the scope of this class, I'm just going to put them kind of together. I like to mix them into the same rule. They don't mean the same thing, so I know if some of you are very, very well aware of what those two things are. They're not the same, but I am going to loop them together into this rule just to make it a little bit easier for people who maybe have never seen these terms before, because it can be kind of a tough thing to understand, and we don't want to spend time memorizing what these things are because we just want to be able to use them. We don't care exactly what they are. They're never going to ask you what a subordinating clause is, but they're going to ask you to use one. So that's why I'm doing it like this. Another way to write this rule that I like maybe a little bit better is dependent, comma, independent. I just write it like that. That simple. Because that's what the rule functions as. So we'll talk about that in a second, but are we familiar with independent and dependent clauses? Pretty much. Online, kinda? Yeah? Okay. Just in case if anyone doesn't know, an independent clause is something that can stand alone by itself and can make sense as a sentence. So, I went to the store is an independent clause, because if you were to put a period at that, it would sound like a complete thought. It makes sense. A dependent clause, on the other hand, would be something that can't stand alone just by itself if you put a period at the end of it. So let's say I said, although I went to the store, period. Well, what do you mean, although you went to the store? What else? It feels like there's more coming. That isn't a complete thought by itself. So therefore, that would be a dependent clause. Does that make sense, everyone here? Online, did that make sense? Okay, awesome. So the idea with this rule is that if you have a dependent clause and then an independent clause, this is the most common theme in English with commas. How do you relate an independent clause to a dependent clause? So those are important words. Glad pretty much everyone knows those ones, so that's awesome. But in this scenario, let's say you started with the dependent clause and you want to go directly into an independent clause without anything in between. You can't exactly do that. But if you go from a dependent clause to an independent clause and you put a comma in between, it's perfectly fine. So this is also known as like an introductory phrase, kind of. So let's say, for example, let's start with a dependent clause. Because I have the best ACT teacher. Okay, that in itself cannot stand alone as a sentence. Because if you say, because I have the best ACT teacher, there's like a feel, there's like a tension that tells you like, hey, you're supposed to go on here. You can't just end it right there. If I were to remove the word because, and I just said, I have the best ACT teacher, perfectly fine. That makes sense as a sentence by itself. But because it says the word because, it's dependent. So now let's add an independent clause at the end of it. Something you guys should be repeating to yourself every day. I am going to do great on the ACT. Now, that is an independent clause. I'm going to do great on the ACT. Period. That's perfectly fine by itself. So, if we were to put these two things together into one sentence, we have to put a comma in between. So it says, because I have the best ACT teacher, I am going to do great on the ACT. With a comma in between. Does that make sense to you guys? Good? Online, does that make sense? Awesome, awesome, awesome. Cool. All right. Let's go to the next rule. This one, a little bit more rare, I would say. It doesn't really come up that often, but I still am going to cover it because if it does, I don't want you to be surprised. But this is 4, right? Fourth one? Okay, thank you. Commas. Set. Oop, I don't. Sorry, I forgot I don't phrase them like that anymore. Commas can set off quotes. Now, as we move more and more toward, I'm going to let you in on a little bit of ACT lore really quick. The ACT over time has gotten easier because it's a business and they want more people to take their tests. So the ACT is getting easier, and a lot of the times they don't cover this rule because it sometimes can get confusing for kids. So to make the test easier, sometimes they take this one off, but I'm going to teach it to you guys just in case. It can set off or introduce. I guess you can say set off or introduce quotes, but more importantly, you're going to see it set off quotes, kind of. So let's say we have a thing. What was my example? Okay. Let's say you're saying, I asked myself, and then you're going to have a quote. Why did I do that? So when you have a quote here, why did I do that? The phrase right before it, I asked myself, has to have a comma to set off into those quotation marks. Now, it also works the other way. So let's say someone's telling you something. Your friend says, hey, don't do that. Then if you want to say that he said that, you have to put a comma after. So now this sentence, the second one here says, hey, comma, don't do that, comma, he said. So again, this time on the outside, if we're saying he said, she said, whatever, after, then the comma goes after the quotation marks. And just to be clear, in this scenario, where you're doing it before, the comma is going to go before the quotation marks, not inside of the quotation marks. If you're doing it after, the comma goes inside of the quotation marks. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, the quotes are going to come after the comma. You don't want to put the comma out here. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. That's why it's a little bit confusing to people, and that's why they don't cover it as much, because sometimes people tend to put the comma here, or they tend to put this one there, which is like understandable, it happens, but this is the correct way to do it. Does that make sense to everyone in person? Online, does that make sense? Awesome. Okay. Let's go to the next one. Now this is a little bit tricky. I'm going to use a word. I don't know if a lot of you will know this one, and that's okay. It's a tricky word. The word is, so commas can set off, make sure I'm spelling this right. Appositives is the word. Commas can set off appositives. Now, does anyone know in here what an appositive is? No. Online, does anyone have a shout? Do you know what that is? Perfectly fine. Didn't know what this was until I started teaching this class, to be totally honest. And that's fine. And a positive is, I'll write it out here just so you guys can have time to copy it in your notes, but it's a noun phrase, or a noun clause that follows a noun to further describe or rename. Rename them. Does that make sense? I know this definition is pretty confusing when you just leave it out there, but for anyone who can't see it, I can move this a little bit closer just so you guys can maybe get a better view. I know it's kind of hard to see back there. And a positive is a noun phrase, or a noun clause that follows after an already said noun to further describe or rename that previous noun or noun phrase or whatever we're talking here. So, oops, let's get these fixed up a little bit. Okay, they can see my face now. Okay, so for example, let's do. Okay, I'm gonna write one down that uses just a noun, and then I'm gonna give you an example of a noun phrase. But I'll just say that one so we don't have to write the whole thing down. But let's start with this one here. Let's talk about, okay, Leo Messi, for example, is an example of a noun. That's a person, place, or thing. Now let's say we wanted a positive right after it. Let's say we want to describe him as the greatest soccer player of all time. Then the greatest soccer player of all time would be a noun phrase. So then we would put that here. The greatest soccer player of all time. And then we could say, I don't know, won the World Cup. Does that make sense? Kind of how we got there. So we started with a noun, and then we followed it with the noun phrase that further explained. So we said Leo Messi, the noun. And then we used, in a positive, the greatest soccer player of all time, and we put commas on either side of that. Won the World Cup in 2022. Now, you could use another example where you have just a noun. So let's say we were talking about, I don't know. I love sports, so we're going to use another sports one. Let's say we were talking about LeBron James, but we didn't name him in that sentence. So we were talking about the best player on the Lakers, and then we could put a comma, LeBron James, comma, blah, 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 whatever you think about him. So that time I had something starting, but we didn't name what was going on. So we wanted to further name the noun that we're talking about, so rename the noun that we were talking about. So then we put a comma and used a noun, his name himself, LeBron James, and then comma, and then continue on. So a lot of the times you're going to see commas on both sides of the appositive. That falls into another rule that we'll cover pretty soon here in a second. But yeah, does that make sense in a positive? Make sense online? Cool. Awesome. All right. Let's get to the next one here. Okay, you're going to use a comma. Are we on 6? Yeah. A comma goes after addressing someone by name. So anytime you address someone by name, you're going to use a comma. Let me find a funny name in class. Oh, none of them are funny. Okay. Let's say, sorry, Jack, I'm going to pick on you. Let's say I'm addressing Jack from the online class about he hasn't done his homework in 2 weeks. So if I'm yelling at him and I say, Jack, do your homework. Then if I write this phrase out, I'm going to put a comma right there, right after addressing him directly by name. So if you're talking to someone directly, you're going to use a comma right after addressing them. Does that make sense? Overall, I feel like that was pretty straightforward, but and this also works when you're addressing someone not exactly by their name, but by a title. So for example, if you're talking to your mom or your dad, Mom, I'm sorry I didn't wash the dishes, you should still use a comma there. Or if you're talking to Grandpa and Grandma, fly the same way here. Mr. and Mrs. also just fly exactly the same. So any type of title. So even a teacher here, if you're talking about a teacher, sorry, teacher, I didn't do my homework, teacher has a comma after it. Does that make sense? Good here? Online? Okay. Let me know if I'm erasing too fast, because I want to give you guys enough time to write things down, but I'm trying to kick in gear too. Are you guys good? All right. Awesome. We are at number 7, and this one, pretty important. Yeah. This is a big one. And the rule simply, I call it the comma hug. That's mostly what if you say comma hug to any person that studies or has studied English before, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. It hugs, and by hug I mean it goes before and it goes after a certain phrase or a certain word. And it's going to hug information that is, I don't know how to spell this word, sorry. It's going to hug information that is interrupting or non-essential. So if something is non-essential or it's interrupting, I like to say you should give it a hug. So you're just going to put 2 commas on either side of what you're doing there. So let's say Jack is coming back at me now, and I'm yelling at him, Jack, you need to do your homework, and he's trying to give me an excuse here. He tells me, I tried several times. Like you said, to do the homework. Okay, so Jack tells me back, I tried several times, like you said, to do the homework. Now, there's a part of this sentence that's completely non-essential to the rest of it. And what non-essential means is that if you were to remove that part from the sentence would still make sense. So, I'm not gonna. Yeah, you got it?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
After times. I tried several times.
Right there? And you're just gonna leave the rest of it, or where do you want to close it?
I think I tried several times is the independent clause, and like you said, to do the homework is the dependent.
That's not exactly what we're looking for here. We're looking for just a small phrase. So you're right, this is an independent clause and this is a dependent clause. But the rule we talked about earlier is when the dependent clause comes first. So here you actually...
The comma would go after several times and then also after said.
Yes, perfect. So the non-essential phrase here is like you said. That's the idea.
Okay.
So the way you can check that is that if you were to remove that phrase entirely from the sentence...
You should be able to still say this.
Yeah, so let's say we just took this out of here. I tried several times to do the homework. Is that still a sound sentence, do you guys think? Yeah. So that's the idea. Since this is non-essential, you can take it out. Then you can put commas on either side of it to give it like a hug, is what we call. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's the idea behind the comma hug. Online, does that make sense? Awesome. Did you guys have enough time to write it down? Okay. Online, you guys had enough time to write it down, I hope? Okay, the thumbs up are still there, so I'm going to assume yes. And also, again, feel free to shout out if you need a little more time to write things down if I'm erasing too fast. All right. Another one that I think is pretty straightforward that we probably know already is the rule that you have to separate adjectives modifying the same noun. So separate adjectives noun. Okay, now what does that mean? So we know an adjective is a describing word, and a noun is a person, place, or thing. So let's say you were talking about when I walked into the class this morning, and you wanted to talk about the blah, 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 blah. Walked in. Okay, we're going to fill it in with adjectives here in a second. But this is the base of the sentence. The something teacher walked in. So we have our subject, our noun here. And now we're going to add some adjectives. So let's say, oh, I don't know. You could, is that how you spell handsome? I don't actually know. I hope so. Yeah, probably. Okay. That's how you spell handsome. Forget about it if it's not. So in this scenario, we used one adjective, and this sentence is perfectly sound how it is. The handsome teacher walked in. Perfectly fine. Now let's say you wanted to add another adjective. Oh, I don't know, like maybe smart? Let's throw that one out there. Have you said the handsome, smart teacher walked in? This now is grammatically not sound. The reason is we have two adjectives describing the same noun, so therefore we have to put a comma in between there. So now it makes sense. The handsome, smart teacher walked in with a comma in between. Let's say you're still not done raving. Maybe you want to add another one. Let's say like humble, because that one's definitely true. So now if we have three adjectives, the rule still holds the same. You're going to put a comma in between each and every adjective that describes the same noun. If they're describing different things, then this is not true. But since they're all describing the teacher, then you're going to use commas in between each of the adjectives. Does that make sense for you guys? Does that make sense online? Awesome. Okay. Whoops. So that is rule number 8. There's one last rule that tends to be one we forget, so that's why I save it to last, because I'm telling you now, you're going to need to remember this one. This is one that, like I said before, a lot of these rules I feel like you could probably do by your intuition. You all speak English, so your intuition might carry you through a lot of these. This one, maybe not true. Your intuition might not carry you through this one because a lot of the times when we're speaking, we don't use this comma. I don't exactly have, like, a lot of them I have like a long sentence or something that'll describe the rule. This one I don't really have that. It's just, I'm going to give you the bare bones of what it looks like. So you're going to have an independent clause, comma, a fanboy's word, and then another independent clause. Okay, now a fanboys. Have you guys heard that term before? Yeah? I think they're like in middle school sometime, or maybe like an early high school English class.
Freshman year was what I remember.
Freshman year, yeah. That's called, they basically, a just simple way to remember a coordinating conjunction. So those words would be for and, you guys know them? Mm-hmm. But, yeah. Yes, awesome. Okay. If you guys don't know them, in the ACT 36 book you guys have, there is a page that covers these. So if you want, in the table of contents, you can look for the punctuations, and fanboys will come up. Or Google is also a perfectly good resource for that. I don't want to spend class time on it just because we have very limited. But if you need to memorize those, feel free to. The rule is that when you have an independent clause and another independent clause, you could just do independent, period, independent. But what if those two things are kind of related and you want them in the same sentence? Then you can put them in the same sentence, but you have to use a fanboys word and a comma to separate them. So my example here, let's... Ooh. Okay, yeah, sorry, that was a little check, but... Okay, let's say you have two independent clauses here. I went to the store. Oh, I forgot the. I went to the store. And I bought milk. Those are our two independent clauses. I went to the store, I bought milk. Now, can I just say that in one sentence? I went to the store, I bought milk. Well, we'd sound like a child, so no. Now let's say we put in our fanboys word. Let's use and here. I went to the store and I bought milk. Do you see how, like, a lot of the times when we're talking and we say something like that, I went to the store and I bought milk, it doesn't feel like we should put a comma there. A lot of these other rules, it feels like there needs to be a comma there. Even when you're saying it, it feels wrong to say it without a comma. This one, it's not exactly like that. When you're talking through this one, I went to the store and I bought milk, it sounds perfectly fine. But because you have two independent clauses, and it's separated by a fanboys word, you need a comma right there before the fanboys. Does that make sense? Now, just to illustrate a point here, what if I were to remove the word and I left it like this? I went to the store. Wait, sorry. Oops, forgot. Remove the wrong word. Sorry, guys. All right, now I made it. I went to the store and bought milk. Does that comma still need to be there? What do you guys think?
Yes, because it's an independent dependent, right?
It is an independent and it is a dependent, but is there a rule that says when you have independent to dependent, you should use a comma? Remember, it goes the other way. So if you have a dependent into independent, then yes. But if you have an independent first and then a dependent clause, so right here, the anatomy of this is really that you have an independent clause right here, and a dependent clause right here, and a fanboys word. Now, something I haven't said before that maybe is like kind of a caveat to this rule, if you want to remember this too, is that if you have an independent clause, a fanboys, and a dependent clause, you need no comma. Then you can just leave it how it is. So here you can say, I went to the store and bought milk without a comma. But if you said, I went to the store and I bought milk, then you have two independent clauses. Then you need to use a comma. But in this scenario that I have on the board right now, the second part is a dependent clause. Bought milk. What does that mean? So in this scenario, you don't need a comma. Does that make sense, the difference between those two? Good. Online, does that make sense? Awesome. Okay, that's all I have for you on commas. Let's jump to colons. Now we're going to get to some that maybe not everyone has used these ones before. We've all used commas, but colons might be a little bit new to some people. They're a little bit confusing. So just in case you don't know, a colon is two dots stacked on top of each other. So like that. It's like sometimes you use it to make a smiley face on like when you're texting. That's a colon. So there is actually, let's see, technically four rules. Yeah, let's go through all of them. So first and foremost, most important, you're going to see this one the most, is that colons introduce a list. So if commas separate items in a list, colons will introduce that list. So for example, if I'm talking, I went to that store that I was talking about a few examples ago, and I'm trying to explain to you what I bought. You can say something like, I bought the following. And then use a colon. And then whatever the heck I bought. I said I was going to buy milk, so let's do that. Milk, cheese, and strawberries. I don't know. Sounds like a nice combo. Milk, cheese, and strawberries. So the emphasis there is, right, this is a rule we talked about before where we use commas in between. And we are going to use the Oxford comma always. And the colon here goes because you're about to set off a list. Now, this works also if you have a question at the second part in your list. You can use this all as part of a question. So if I were to say, I'm not going to write this one out just for the sake of time, but let's say I'm asking someone, which ice cream flavor is your favorite? Strawberry, vanilla, or chocolate? So I had a list there at the end, right? Strawberry, vanilla, or chocolate. That means that right before I set it off, so I said which ice cream flavor is your favorite? Colon. Vanilla, strawberry, or what did I say? Vanilla, strawberry, or chocolate? Question mark. Does that make sense kind of how that comes in? Now there's a lot of times you can introduce the list without a colon, so don't think you have to use this every time. Like in this scenario, what if I just did this? I bought milk, cheese, and strawberries. It's perfectly fine by itself. You don't always have to use a colon. But a colon is a way to introduce a list. Does that make sense? Online, does that make sense? Cool. Good. All right. Now, there is a scenario. Does everyone know how a period works? I'm going to assume everyone knows how a period works. It's just you separate independent clauses with a period, right? Now, you can do that with a colon, technically. You can separate clauses. And not just independent clauses. You can technically separate dependent and independent clauses. That's a very big technicality. But you can just separate clauses, let's say. And the reason you would do that is for emphasis on anything that you're talking about. If you want to provide extra emphasis on something you're saying on two different clauses, then you could use a colon. So, let's say, who else can I pick on right now? Let's say Andy is trying to influence Jack because Jack's not been doing his homework. And Andy's like, come on, it's not a big deal. The teacher only said it once. You don't even have to do the homework. No one does the homework, which is not true. Everyone does. And Andy's trying to influence Jack something. And Jack says back, well, she says, or I don't know, Andy could be either. Andy tells Jack, why do you want to do this anyway? It's not even that important. And Jack replies something like, to provide emphasis, he's going to use a colon. He says, my reason is simple. I put two different clauses on the board right now. This is what Jack said. He says, my reason is simple, the teacher said so. There's two different clauses right there. You could very easily put periods at the end of both of them. But Jack wants to provide emphasis, so he's going to use a colon. So he says, my reason is simple, colon. The teacher said so. Does that make sense? Makes sense? Online, does that make sense?
Does that always have to be a colon, or could it also be a comma?
In this scenario, it cannot be a comma because they're both independent clauses. But there are times where it can be a comma. But more often than not, if you just have two things and you're trying to provide emphasis, you would probably use a colon or a semicolon, which we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, you wouldn't use a comma in this scenario, no. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. Now there's a small little test-taking tip I want to give you guys quick. That if you get to a test, and let me give you an important thing first. That the ACT, again, you're an editor, right? You're not going to make choices based on, oh, maybe this is better, maybe this is better. If two things are correct, they're not going to make you pick between two correct things, right? So let's say right here, you have a question that says, okay, what's the correct type of punctuation right there? And one of the options is a period to say, my reason is simple. The teacher said so. Perfectly fine, right? Now the other option is a colon. My reason is simple. The teacher said so. Well, both of those seem perfectly fine, right? And there's nothing different in them other than the fact that it's a period or a colon. Well, then how do you pick between the two? The answer is the ACT is never, ever, 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 ever going to make you do that. So if you see an answer choice where nothing is different other than the fact that there's a colon or a period, or in a minute we're going to talk about a semicolon, then you can eliminate both of those answer choices because they're never going to make you pick between the two of them. And I'm telling you that now so you know. So you can say, well, there's something else wrong then. So it can't be those ones. And you can cross those two out. Does that make sense how you would know to cross them out? Does that make sense online? Yeah, awesome. Okay, cool. So they would never make you pick between something like that. So, cool. Another thing, how they tee off lists, they can also tee off explanations. So, oh, we're running out of time, jeez. Can introduce an explanation. For example, an explanation or a clarification. I guess you should say this can be a clarification too. Forget that that's spelled terribly wrong. Whatever, we're not going to leave that up there because that's embarrassing. But explanation or clarification. Now, I'm not going to write this example for the sake of time, but it could be like something as obvious as the ACT might say, let me clarify what I meant by this. So let's say we're talking about the word genius. That can mean a lot of different things. So let's say I'm explaining and I say, let me clarify what I mean by genius, colon. Someone who is really, really, really smart. And you'd put commas in between all those reallys because they're adjectives. But anyway, yeah. Does that make sense how I did that? Where if you're trying to tee off something that is clarifying or explaining more, then you're going to use colon. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm sorry I wasn't able to write that example. We're running super duper low on time here. And then last colon rule that I'll throw you here is that you can introduce a quote. Now, for an example here, let's say I always live by the age-old saying. You could use colons here to introduce your quote. A colon to introduce your quote. What's an age-old quote? Oh, how about something like, hard work pays off. So here you have a colon introducing some quotes. I always live by the age-old saying, colon, hard work pays off. So this is another example where you could use a comma here, right? Because we talked about a comma teeing off quotes, right? So similar. The more you're in this class and once we cover more punctuation, you'll understand it happens a lot where you could use one thing, you could use another thing. And your job is to pick, they're going to give you a bunch, there's going to be 4 options and you're going to pick the one that's actually grammatically sound. They're going to try to trick you and use a bunch of different rules, but you're not going to fall for it because you know the rules. But, so for now, I'll probably let you go here in a minute, but for now, today we've covered commas and colons. Next time I'm here, we will go through the rest of the punctuation, and we're going to finish just taking notes on those. And there'll be semicolons, apostrophes, dashes, and hyphens. They're going to be the 4 that we'll cover next time. There's not as many rules for those. There's 9 comma rules, which is a lot. They're the most important, so that's why we spent so much time on it today. But my recommendation for now is just remember that these rules are, we'll just end with like a little, I'll give you a little minute spiel here, but these rules are super duper duper important. If you remember at the beginning, I told you punctuation is 13% of the test, and if you know all these rules really, really, really well, then 13% of the questions you already know right away and you don't have to think about because you just know them. They're going to take you 5 to 10 seconds like we want because you know the rules, just like that. So for example, when I took this class back in the day, the tutor that I had gave a very, very similar lecture to what I just did. And we went through all the rules, and she recommended that I write them down on a cheat sheet. So like a lot of you have going, just one piece of paper or one sheet on an iPad or whatever. And we wrote down all the rules. And then every single night for about 2 weeks, right before I went to bed, I would read all my rules. And then it was only 2 weeks. After that, every time I took a practice test, there was never a punctuation question where I didn't know exactly what rule it was referring to. Doesn't mean I'd have got all of them right. Sometimes I misremembered a rule or something, but I always knew exactly what rule it was referring to. And with 2 more weeks of memorizing, by that point, I've never missed a punctuation question again. And the actual ACT. I mess up all the time in real life, but everyone messes up in real life. It's fine. But on the ACT, I hadn't missed a punctuation question after. And all I did was go right before I went to bed, just study those rules a little bit. So that's my recommendation to you guys, is just do a little bit every day. Just try to run through this list that you have in your notes, just a little bit every day. And those rules are going to be a lot easier to remember if you just space them out and do a little bit. Don't try to remember them all at one time because it's going to be really hard. It's extremely overwhelming. So we've gone through about half of the rules today. We'll cover the other half next class. And then you're going to have a super good base on punctuation. So that's all I have for you today. I will give you guys about a 5 to 10 minute break. Manoj will come in and deal with the second half. Thank you guys online. I'll see you in a few weeks, I think. Okay. You guys know where the bathrooms are?
No.
Okay. In case you want to, the bathroom is up this hall and to the left. That open door.